John Sifton, you're holding a news conference today with other human rights groups. Can you expand on, health rights are also a human right, but go further and talk about your overall human rights concerns with the TPP?
Well, there are issues both within the agreement with respect to the health issues, but also labor rights issues. And then there are issues that are larger on the geopolitical level. The simple fact is this agreement rewards several countries which have atrocious human rights records. One of them is Vietnam, a one-party, undemocratic state ruled by the Communist Party of Vietnam. No elections, no freedom of speech. This is a country which locks up dissidents for criticizing the government, voicing their own issues. So that's one trading partner. Another, Brunei. The Sultan of Brunei wants to impose Sharia law, which would result in adulterers being stoned to death, thieves having their hands cut off, homosexuals whipped. This is a country which is also non-democratic, ruled by fiat, by a sultan who inherited his power through birth. Then you have countries like Malaysia, which, although emerging democracies, have serious problems with freedom of expression and rights of lesbian, gay, transgender people. Singapore, the city-state next to Malaysia, also has serious problems with labor rights and freedom of expression. All these countries would be rewarded by the United States. We'd like to see the United States use the agreement as leverage to compel these countries to improve their human rights records. And yet, over the last 4 or 5 years, that hasn't really happened. A couple of the countries have made baby steps. Vietnam's done a few minor things, but by and large, no big agreements. Malaysia, in fact, its human rights record has gotten worse.
Well, this is President Obama speaking last month about how the TPP would improve worker conditions in Vietnam, as well as here in the United States.
So when you look at a country like Vietnam, under this agreement, Vietnam would actually, for the first time, have to raise its labor standards. It would have to set a minimum wage. It would have to pass safe workplace laws to protect its workers. It would even have to protect workers' freedom to form unions for the very first time. That would make a difference. That helps to level the playing field, and it would be good for the workers in Vietnam, even as it helps make sure that they're not undercutting competition here in the United States. So that's progress.
John Sifton, that was President Obama speaking. Could you comment on what he said about the likelihood of worker conditions improving as a consequence of the TPP?
Well, look, we give credit to the administration for pushing along a good labor chapter that would have provisions that would do some of the things that President Obama said. Problem is, all that would be on paper. The key issue here is, would those provisions be enforceable? Would Vietnamese workers be able to actually compel the government of Vietnam to make those supposed paper reforms a reality? And that's where the Obama administration has been very disingenuous. They suggest the labor chapter is enforceable. What they mean is that if Vietnam fails to meet the standards, a non-existent Vietnamese union would bring a claim in a non-existent tribunal to compel Vietnam to improve its rights? No. The only possibility is that an outside group, maybe an international labor federation, could compel another country, like the United States, to bring a complaint against Vietnam about its labor practices in the abstract. And maybe after many years of tribunal litigation, that would result in some kind of penalty being imposed on Vietnam. That's not enforceability. That's merely a process which might potentially impact Vietnam's reform process on the grand scale. There is nothing like the rights that investors have to compel governments to change their rules. And that, at the end of the day, is what's wrong with the TPP. It creates rights for companies and investors, but it doesn't create new rights for workers or civil society. It basically gives corporations more rights than people.
So some are saying even if you can't negotiate these things after the TPP, you can use the TPP to change things as you negotiate it. Some openly gay lawmakers have called for halting TPP negotiations with Malaysia and Brunei because of their laws targeting lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender citizens. But Colorado Congressmember Jared Polis, who's openly gay, has called on the Obama administration to use the trade agreement to push for reform. He wrote a letter earlier this year saying, quote, as negotiations over the TPP proceed, I hope you'll seize the occasion by expressing to the governments of Brunei and Malaysia in no uncertain terms that their violations of basic human rights must end. John Sifton, if you could respond to that using the negotiations to change these countries, but also then the two of you disagree over what should be done with TPP. John, you're with the reform TPP crowd, and Peter, you're with the stop it, end it. And I'd like to hear your views on this. John.
Well, first off, let me say, the problem with the idea of compelling government of Malaysia and Vietnam to improve through the negotiation process is that that's already been going on. For 4 or 5 years, the United States has been pushing these reform agendas, and these countries have not shown any willingness to make meaningful steps. So the real question for the administration is, how is having fast-track authority going to make it any better? At the end of the day, it's our position that if the United States, if the administration is compelled to reach certain benchmarks on human rights, not just labor rights, but other human rights, political prisoners in Vietnam, LGBT issues in Malaysia, if they're compelled by law to actually meet those benchmarks as part of the agreement to allow fast-track authority or allow the government to present the TPP back once it's finalized, then it will be a necessity. These countries will have to reform, otherwise they can't be part of the agreement. And that would be an incentive that wouldn't exist otherwise. So essentially what we're saying is, yeah, the TPP could be used for leverage, but you have to actually use it for leverage. And if you don't, it's going to be a huge disappointment. And when you actually come back with the negotiated agreement, then you're going to see human rights groups and others saying, no, don't vote for this agreement. We're against it. But for now, our position is, yes, let's compel the administration to write this agreement in a way that actually protects human rights, that actually promotes human rights, that actually abandons the ridiculous, unconscionable provisions on intellectual property that will lead to higher drug costs. If you make those changes and then go out and negotiate, and it actually compels Vietnam to improve its record, great. If you can't do it, though, you're going to be out of luck when you bring this agreement back to Congress when it's done.
Peter May-Barduk, you're with the Stop TPP crowd, not reform it, as John is. Why?
Well, there's no such thing as a good TPP. You know, there have been some very brave negotiators from some of the developing countries in the negotiation who've been standing up to some of the most powerful industries on earth in defense of their country's various public interests, including health. But at the end of the day, the multinational corporations involved aren't going to accept a text that reduces their rights. And so we're not going to see a TPP that has positive effects for society the way many of us would. The predicted benefits and gains in terms of trade flows are very small. The predicted costs are very large. So I don't know why Congress would want to cede its constitutional authority to the executive, to the president, giving the president fast-track authority to ram a deal through Congress on an up or down vote without possibility for amendment when the whole thing has been negotiated in secret all this time. As I say, only a few chapters have leaked. That, of course, is unofficial. What's in the other 25-plus chapters of the agreement that we don't know about? What unfortunate surprises that could have real consequences for human beings. So we invite your viewers to go to stopfasttrack.com and your listeners and to call their member of Congress today ahead of this very close and very important vote on fast-track trade promotion authority. Say no to fast-track.
And I'd say, look, we don't disagree at the end of the day about these issues because the substantive underlying issues are the same. If people want to call their member of Congress and tell them, I'm uncomfortable with this agreement, they should do that. And look, we work on Syria, we work on North Korea. We have to be optimistic about the idea, in theory, that the Obama administration could do better. If Peter's right and they can't, and there's no such thing as a good TPP, then so be it. Then the time will come when it's time to oppose it. So I don't think there's a disagreement here. And yes, your listeners should go call their congresspeople today. The vote is tomorrow.
And Peter, before we conclude, could you just explain specifically what you think the impact of this deal would be on drugs that are used over the long term, for instance, cancer or HIV drugs?
Certainly. Well, there's a combination of provisions in the intellectual property chapter, enforceable potentially through the investment chapter, affected in terms of negotiation powers in this leak that just came out yesterday, published by WikiLeaks, that show us that the generic competition, the affordable medicines on which people around the world in many TPP countries depend would be blocked through the expanding monopoly powers of the industry under this agreement. That includes the patent evergreening rules that you mentioned in your run-up. But for example, if we look at cancer, there's a rule proposed that was tucked in through a massive lobbying effort by the pharmaceutical industry, tucked into Obamacare, for 12-year automatic monopolies on biologics, which include a great many cancer drugs. 11 to 12 cancer treatments approved recently by the FDA cost more than $100,000. That's a leading driver of bankruptcy for American families and leads to devastating consequences, routinely to death for people in developing countries. So if competition is blocked for a long period of time, governments aren't going to even be able to offer some of these treatments to their citizens, and people will suffer.
And it's madness on the issue of antivirals for HIV/AIDS. It's amazing that one part of this government, PEPFAR, which is the president's agenda for combating HIV/AIDS worldwide, they'll see higher costs to their budget as they try to help countries fight HIV/AIDS, because antivirals, second-stage antivirals, the kind you have to use once the initial ones wear off after a certain number of years of use, are going to be more expensive. Not to mention that all these groups, these humanitarian groups on the ground, are obliged to use subpar generic antivirals, even though they're better drugs that are coming on market, simply because of this expansion in the patent protections. It's really unconscionable.
John Sifton, we want to thank you very much for being with us. I know you have to run off to your news conference over at the you're holding at the National Press Club. John Sifton is with Human Rights Watch, and together with Oxfam America, as well as other groups like the Council on Global Equality, they will be speaking out against TPP. And thank you very much to Peter Mavarduk, Director of Public Citizens Global Access to Medicines Program. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, has ISIS trumped al-Qaeda? Actually begun to destroy it? We go to London to talk with a journalist with The Guardian. Stay with us.